As one of the world's most glamorous cities, Manhattan is home to iconic landmarks like Central Park, the Empire State Building, and the Statue of Liberty. But how did this concrete jungle become what it is today? What many people don't realize is that without the Mafia, Manhattan might not have been built at all. Before we get started, be sure to hit that like button for more videos. Also stick around until the end to find out which mobster was once a police officer. You won't want to miss this. The early 1900s were a wild time in New York City. The population had skyrocketed from 3.4 million people in 1900 to over 7.4 million just 20 years later. This meant that housing was at a premium, and building upward seemed like the only solution. And so skyscrapers began to dominate the New York City skyline. But while the titans of industry were busy making millions, the government wasn't exactly focused on safety regulations. In fact, there was very little government involvement in construction at all. With so much work to be done and not enough officials to oversee it, corruption ran rampant. Bribery of inspectors and politicians was commonplace. And if you weren't willing to play the game, your building just wouldn't get approved. This created a massive opportunity for a group of ambitious Italian immigrants who were willing to do whatever it took to make a buck. These men would eventually become known as the Mafia, and their first order of business was real estate. Construction was dangerous, backbreaking work. And with the government refusing to step in and protect the workers, someone else had to take charge. That's where the Mafia came in. They offered protection to the construction companies, but at a steep price. Of course, the construction companies had no choice but to pay up or risk having their workers injured, or worse. The men who ran these organizations were known as the bosses. Under them were the soldiers, the enforcers, and the ones who carried out the dirty work. Next came the associates, which was basically anyone who worked in the construction industry. And finally, there were the civilians, which included everyone else. Of course, the Mafia didn't just offer protection. They also provided valuable services like labor. The construction companies were often desperate for workers, and the Mafia was happy to oblige. For a price, of course. This allowed the Mafia to get their hands on some of the biggest construction projects in New York City. One of the most important things to understand about the Mafia is that they operated like a business. They had to make money to survive. And they knew that the construction industry was booming, so they invested heavily in it. They set up shop in the construction yards and began to run things like a well-oiled machine. They had the manpower to get the job done right, and they knew how to keep the profits rolling in. One of the ways they did this was by setting up a system of kickbacks. Basically, they would pay someone in the construction company a little extra to ensure that they got the inside scoop on all the projects. This way they could bid accordingly and make sure that they were always in the black. Another way they made money was by simply stealing from the construction sites. This could include stealing materials, equipment, or even cash. It all depended on what was available. The Mafia wasn't above doing this. In fact, they thrived on it. It was a great way to make some quick cash, and they didn't have to worry about getting caught. After all, they had their own private army to keep them safe. While the Mafia was busy raking in the cash, the construction companies were making a killing. They didn't have to worry about things like safety or liability insurance, because the Mafia had taken care of that. They also didn't have to pay their workers very much, because the Mafia had them by the balls. So the construction companies were able to pocket huge profits, and the Mafia was able to stay in business. It was a win-win situation. By the 1920s, the Mafia had become so powerful that they were essentially running the construction industry in New York City. They had their fingers in every pie, and they knew how to make money. The construction companies loved it because they didn't have to deal with any of the headaches associated with running a business. They could just focus on making money and leave everything else to the Mafia. The buildings that were being constructed during this time were some of the most iconic in New York City history. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, and Radio City Music Hall were just a few of the projects that the Mafia had a hand in. So not only did the Mafia help to build Manhattan, but they did it in style. In the 1930s, the government finally decided to step in and do something about the Mafia. They passed a series of laws that made it illegal to engage in racketeering and other criminal activities. They also cracked down on police corruption, and that made it much harder for the Mafia to operate. Plus, the Great Depression hit New York City hard, and there wasn't as much construction going on, so the Mafia had less opportunities to make money. Despite this, the Mafia still managed to survive. They went underground and began to operate more discreetly. They also diversified their income streams and began to get involved in other industries such as gambling and prostitution. During World War II, construction picked up again as the government began to build up for the war effort. This meant that the Mafia had more opportunities to make money. They were particularly active in the construction of military bases and factories. However, they were also targeted by the government as enemy aliens because most of the bosses were Italian. This led to a number of arrests and even some deportations. Despite this setback, the Mafia was still a powerful force in New York City construction by the end of the war. They had learned to operate more discreetly, and they had a lot of cash on hand thanks to their involvement in wartime profiteering. The post-war years saw a lot of construction as the city tried to rebuild from the damage caused by World War II. The Mafia was there to capitalize on this, as always. They were particularly active in the construction of housing projects, as the city tried to accommodate the influx of new residents. However, by this time, the government was much more aware of the Mafia's activities, and they began to crack down. There were a number of high-profile arrests and convictions, which led to a decline in Mafia power. Still, the Mafia was far from finished. They simply went back underground and continued to operate more discreetly than ever before. While the Mafia is no longer the powerhouse that it once was, it still exists today. And who knows how much longer it will be around. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our other content. We've got plenty of videos about the Mafia and organized crime, as well as videos about the construction of some of the most iconic buildings in New York City. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Now here's an interesting fact about the Mafia that you won't learn anywhere else. One of the most powerful mobsters of all time was once a police officer. His name was Michael Francis, aka Crazy Joe Gallo. He was born in 1911 in New York City and joined the police force in 1930. Galloway quickly made a name for himself as a ruthless killer and was involved in several high-profile cases. However, he was also involved in some shady dealings of his own and was eventually arrested for bribery. He was forced to resign from the police force, but this didn't stop him from continuing his career in law enforcement. He simply switched over to the Mafia and became one of the most feared mobsters of all time. Galloway was involved in a number of lucrative rackets, including gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking. He was also responsible for several murders and was even implicated in the Lufthansa heist. One of the largest robberies in U.S. history, Galloway was eventually killed in a mob hit in 1972, but his legacy lives on. He is considered to be one of the most ruthless and powerful mobsters of all time. If you want to know more about the Mafia, be sure to check out our other videos. We've got plenty of content on the most ruthless crime syndicate in the world. Thanks for watching. Till next time.